What is up everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video I wanted to do something similar to my last one and talk about my study schedule for step 2. Last video I did a full breakdown of how I studied and passed step 1 in 3 weeks, so if you haven't watched that, go check that out before watching this. You'll see a lot of the things that I did for step 2 is similar to what I did for step 1 between different resources that I used and just general thoughts about studying. So to start off the video, I wanted to talk about the different resources that I used because I'm going to be covering in that more in detail as we get into the actual schedule. So I just want to kind of list everything that I used. So the first big thing, which should be a staple for anyone's study plan, is some sort of question bank. I ended up using UWorld and Amboss, and I'm going to go into more detail about that later, which one I ended up liking more and sort of focusing on. But regardless, everyone needs to use some sort of question bank, and UWorld and Amboss are sort of the gold standards right now. Other than that, another sort of staple for a lot of people, not everyone, but throughout all of medical school, I've been using Anki. Used it pretty much since day one. I've used it in different ways over the years between preclinical, clerkship, step 1 and step 2, but it's kind of always been in my study rotation. For me, it's the best way to go over content multiple times and make sure it's sticking because of spaced repetition. Another resource that I used pretty heavily was old practice shelf exams that I took throughout my core clerkship year. I saw a lot of advice online to go back and do those, even if you've done them several times during your clerkship year. It's really important to get as many practice questions in the NBME style as possible. And then aside from those 3 things, the only other resource I really used was practice exams. So I ended up doing 3 of the UWorld self-assessments just because I had them, because of the subscription that I got right before clerkships. I got kind of the biggest package that they have, which was I think a 2-year subscription, and you got all 3 of the self-assessments. So I had them, thought might as well take them. And then I ended up doing pretty much all of the current NBME practice exams. I think it was forms 9 through 15, so quite a bit. And then on top of that also did the free 120s, which aren't full official practice exams, but they're pretty close and a really good way to test yourself right before the exam. So this is sort of the first big difference between step 1 and step 2. During step 1, I did use a lot more of third-party video resources to refresh myself on some of the nitty-gritty detail basic science stuff that I forgot during my clerkship year. Because step 2 is a lot more clinically focused and I was just coming off of my step 1 dedicated, I didn't really have to use a lot of third-party resources just to learn concepts again. I didn't really use a lot of Boards and Beyond or Sketchy. Once again, partly because I had already gone over a decent amount of content while I was studying for step 1. And also this was at the end of my clerkship year, but that's where, your studying might differ from mine, because if there was some sort of concept that you were really weak on a shelf, say you started with your OBGYN clerkship and then, you had forgotten a lot of that stuff along the way just because it's kind of niche and it's not really tested in all the other clerkships, it might be a good idea to go back, use video resources or textbook or whatever to brush up on those topics. And moving into my actual schedule, I did probably a slightly unhealthy amount of research between going on Reddit, YouTube, all that kind of stuff, trying to gather as much information as possible to figure out what the best study strategy was going to be. For step 1, obviously it's really important, but it's pass fail. So as long as you're getting around a 65%, you're probably going to pass. Step 2 is very different because it's pretty much the only standardized objective score on our residency applications now. Obviously you have clerkship grades, but those are extremely subjective. Some schools don't even give tiered grades for that. My school, we do honors, high pass, pass fail. Some schools just do pass fail. So that becomes a very subjective thing when, a residency program is evaluating applicants. They don't really know how to compare a student who went to a school that does pass fail for their clerkships versus one who doesn't. So really now step 2 is the only sort of great equalizer between students from the same med school and different med schools. So I wanted to make sure that I sort of had all the information that I wanted to be able to figure out how I should go about studying. And that's sort of one of the biggest things that I give advice on, is you really want to go in with a plan. I had sort of an extended time period for studying for step 2, so I had some flexibility of how I wanted to set up my studying, but say you have like a 3 or 4 week period of dedicated, before it even starts, you want to have a very solid plan. So you're not, waking up in the morning and thinking, oh, like what should I study? Like you want it all mapped out ahead of time and you just wake up and go. So with that being said, I'll move into my actual plan. And similar to my last video, I'm just gonna put up screen recordings of a calendar that I made in Excel. Just like with step 1, I think the most important way to start your studying is to get a baseline assessment. Now, there's a few different ways you can do that. You can either use an NBME test or sort of a third-party test like UWorld, Amboss. I chose to go with an NBME test just because probably going to be the closest to what is on the actual test day, because a lot of these practice exams are old, retired step 2 questions. So that's how I started off my studying. Going back to step 1, I took it on the Monday of Christmas week, took a few days off to celebrate Christmas with my family. And then that Friday is when I took my first practice exam. So it was December 27th. Got that score. Took another few days off. I think I went over the test, but I wasn't like really seriously studying until I got back to New Jersey, which was on that Sunday after. So pulling up the schedule, the first thing that you'll notice that is different between my step 2 and my step 1 schedules is I had way more time to study for step 2. Our school gives us 6 weeks to study for each, since I knew that step 1 was pass fail, and I did pretty well on like my baseline that the school makes us take. I chose to sort of speed through my step 1 studying in order to give myself more time for step 2. So I ended up having like 7.5 weeks to study for step 2, which is pretty long. I'm glad I took not the most amount of time because I took it on a Wednesday. I could have pushed it off to like a Friday or Saturday. But I mean, it was kind of pushing it for how long I was studying. I really wouldn't have wanted 8, 9, 10 weeks just because you're dragging it out so long. And you'll see on my practice exams, I peaked a week or so before my exam and then my score started to decline. It's hard to say if that was because my studying was extended or those last 2 tests I took were just like a little bit harder. But yeah, I think it's important to find a balance of having enough time to prep but not going so long to where you're getting too burnt out and then starting to forget stuff that you studied at the beginning. But as you can see here, I started off the first few days after taking my baseline, just doing a bunch of UWorld, trying to get back in the flow of step 2 questions because they're pretty different from step 1 questions. And pretty quickly I realized that UWorld probably wasn't going to work for me. And that is because I primarily use UWorld during my clerkship year to study for my shelves. It breaks it down really easy. There was 1,100 IM questions. So during my IM clerkship, I just did all those questions. And I don't know for sure how much overlap there is between the step 2 QBank for UWorld and the shelf exam QBank, but even in the first few days, I just started to recognize a lot of the same questions. There was definitely different ones too, but I felt like there was a pretty significant overlap. And even though I didn't remember every single question, it's not like, oh, I read the first sentence and I could just skip to the answers because I had just like memorized it. I just felt like pretty significant familiarity with the questions. I don't really know how to explain it, but I was scoring a lot better than I thought I was going to on those first few days of UWorld, at least compared to like my first pass of UWorld during clerkship year. Because of that, I started to look into Amboss, and I actually had access to the QBank because of step 1. Me and Mackenzie split the cost of like the Amboss QBank because thankfully Amboss, it's one fee for their QBank for step 1, 2, and 3, as opposed to UWorld, it's all like separate subscriptions that are like way more expensive than Amboss. So if you're trying to find like the most cost-effective thing, definitely go with Amboss. But yeah, I started to look more into Amboss and what they had and decided to make the switch to Amboss instead of going through a full second pass of UWorld, just because I felt like I had already seen a lot of those questions before and it would be better to have them presented in a different way with Amboss. And as you can see, looking through my schedule, a lot of the days I had specific like topics that I was going to go over. And that's another good thing about Amboss is they have sort of a dedicated step 2 study plan where they just have everything separated by subject. And it was very easy to just go through that. I would do 2 blocks of 40 for GI and then 2 blocks of 40 for blood and lymph. Like it just took a lot of the thinking out of trying to structure my studying, just because I started from the top of this list and just went down. And this is where we can talk about two different theories of studying for these exams. A lot of people think that you should only do completely random blocks because that is how it's going to be on test day. And while I definitely agree with that, that is kind of how I studied more so for step 1, because I was just doing all of the old MBME exams, so those are random. And that is kind of how I studied during my clerkships, at least for like IM and surgery. I wouldn't really, focus on cardiology this day. I just kind of did everything. I kind of had a different opinion during step 2, and it wasn't even really a different opinion. I just think that you should use both. I think you should have some like very focused studying where, okay, you know that this is all going to be GI. Yes, it is going to bias you a little bit because there are presentations of some things that it could be, a heart attack or pancreatitis, just because, heart attack pain can present like stomach pain. So in that sense, like, that, all right, this is going to be a GI topic. So it might be a little bit easier in that sense, but I also think that going into that, it lets you tease out differences between diagnosis in the same system better if you already know that it's going to be a GI question, if that makes sense. It makes you have to think a little bit less about what is going on and then just focus on the details of like, okay, this word means it is this diagnosis over that one, even though like they're super similar. So that's why I sort of chose to go system by system. Also, there's just so much content that I definitely forgot throughout the year, and I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything or like brushing over any topics by doing stuff random. But you can see there are still several days where I have UWorld mixed in there. It's a very small amount compared to the AMBOSS, but the way I did it was, for the AMBOSS, I would go through system by system like I just talked about, but then the UWorld I would do on random blocks. So I was still getting the practice of anything is fair game. I could be tested on a biostats question, and then the next one would be cardiology, then the next one renal. So I was still getting that practice, but I was able to sort of lock in on different topics every single day. And another thing that AMBOSS does well is in those sort of pre-made decks of 40, they will have like 15 PE questions in a row. Some people might see that as a negative because it's like, okay, it's going to be a PE. That's like, that's sort of cheating. But again, you can have so many different presentations of PE and they can test you on so many different things. It might be like a risk factor question versus a complication question. It might be a heart failure question that it ends up being like a massive PE. So by doing questions about the same diagnosis back to back to back, you really get like a full sense of everything that can be tested on that one subject. And just sort of another plug for AMBOSS, it has a very extensive medical library that you can look up articles for pretty much every single disease that you would ever see on a step exam or shelf or anything. And you can also study by going to an article, reading it, and then doing a question set all on those topics. So sometimes I would, in IM, like read about arrhythmias and then do a bunch of arrhythmia questions. It's another like really good feature of AMBOSS, and why now I think it is a little bit better than UWorld, just because it's so much more than just a QBank. There is that medical library that integrates very well with it. So yeah, I think if you're a student and trying to pick between UWorld and AMBOSS, you can't go wrong with either, because I have friends who did insanely well in step 2 and only used UWorld. But after sort of comparing the two, between using mostly AMBOSS during step and then mostly UWorld during my core rotations, if I had to go back, I would probably use AMBOSS just for those other sort of bells and whistles of having better organization and the medical library. Now, to get back on track after that tangent and plug for AMBOSS, I promise I'm not sponsored or anything. So going back to my schedule, I guess I can talk about how many questions a day I was trying to do. During step 1, it usually ended up being like 100 questions a day, and that is mostly because it would take half of a practice exam every single day. The practice exams are 200 questions, so half of that is 100. In step 2, there was a lot more content to get through because I wanted to get a full pass of AMBOSS just because I hadn't used it before and I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing out on any topic. So because that, on average, I think I probably did like 200 questions a day. There were some days where it was 160, sometimes it was 240, but compared to Step 1, I was doing so many more questions. And while the first few weeks it was really a grind, you just kind of get used to it. It sounds awful, but it is what it is, and you have to get through that many questions if you want to do well in this exam, just because the breadth of information is so wide. And even though there's a vast sort of variety of information, you still have to know a lot of details, and that's why you need to do 20 questions on AFib. It's not, oh, you see it once, you're going to get it right on the test. You really need to master all these topics, and that's how you do it, is just by doing a lot of questions. So yeah, that was sort of a general rundown on how many questions I was doing a day. So as I mentioned, I took my first practice test on December 27th, and then I just did a whole week of studying, and then I took my second practice exam. So my next 3 practice exams were actually all the UWorld ones. As I mentioned, I just had it because of the UWorld subscription that I bought a year ago. And I wanted to make sure I was just using them and not like letting them go to waste. So I chose to do those 3 exams as my next 3 and then focus on all the NBME ones towards the end, again, because Step 2 is written by the same people who write those NBME exams. So by the start of week 5 of my studying, I was pretty much done with all of the non-NBME material. So another reason why I was doing so many AMBOSS questions every single day is I wanted to get through it as fast as possible, so then I could transition over to, 1, doing the NBME full lengths, and then also doing the old shelf exams. As I mentioned earlier, I saw a lot of advice to at least do some of those shelf exams again, because they test the same topics in very similar ways. Honestly, after going through all of that content, they will use the same exact questions or pictures on Step 2 and on the shelf exams. So I think that is like a crucial thing to really rely on your studying. Even if you had already seen those before during like your clerkship year, seeing those same pictures and just becoming very familiar with how NBME questions are written, I think is so important. That's like half the battle of this test. It's not all just knowing everything. Because of how fast you need to go on test day, you really need good pattern recognition, and you need to sort of know the theory of how these questions are written so you can work through them very fast. So starting week 5, I started to do a lot of the old shelf exams. I want to say that I did all of the IM ones, all the surgery ones, half or 75% of all of the other subjects. So FM, peds, neuro, psych were the other subjects that I did some of them, but not all of them. Again, starting in week 5, I went back to doing the NBME practice exams, and I upped my frequency of 1 practice exam a week to 2, and that's just because I needed to get through them. I didn't have 3 months to study, so I started to do 2 a week. I would, do 1, take a few days to review it, and then do some other shelf exams, and then take another one. And yeah, I just maintained that pattern for 2 weeks, and then looking at the week before my exam, I changed it up a little bit and actually went back to some of the AMBOSS content. So another plug for AMBOSS, and something that you'll see a lot on Reddit, especially now that they changed the exam probably 6 months ago at this point. They have a lot more emphasis on ethics, quality improvement, biostats, which AMBOSS has really good resources for that, articles and practice questions. I honestly don't know what UWorld has for those topics. I'm sure they have a lot of questions like that. Kind of just unanimously recommended that you work through those AMBOSS things. So again, quality improvement, ethics, and biostats, just because it is a bigger emphasis on the test now than it was even like a year ago. So I wanted to save that content for the end. 1, it's sort of a break from the really heavy science content, but also stuff like biostats, ethics. I just wanted it to be very fresh in my head going into test days. Another thing that I did in the last week was AMBOSS has a preset 200 question high yield concepts sort of playlist that I redid. Technically, I'd already done all those questions because I went through a full passive AMBOSS. But again, if something is in the high yield topics playlist, I want to make sure I really know it. So that's why I just redid all of those questions about a week before my test. And then in the last few days before my exam, I did my incorrects for all of my like full length practice exams. And then also I did the different free 120s. So I briefly mentioned those earlier. The free 120s are free practice questions that the USMLE gives out. The newest one is always like web-based, so you do it on a website that really simulates like the screens and everything in the tutorial that you'll see on test day. So that's why it's recommended to take it right before as sort of a practice run of what you're going to see on the exam. And again, a lot of people recommend it because they think that it is the most representative of what you're going to see on test day. Honestly, having done all of the practice exams and 2 of the free 120s, pretty similar, honestly. You will see after you take all these exams that they like testing the same topics and the same like little details of things. So I don't know, it's hard to say if the free 120 is more representative than the practice exams, but regardless, I think you should do them. And then that brought us to test day. It was very similar to step 1, get there early in the morning, check in, and this test was like 40 more questions than step 1, or maybe not exactly 40, I think it might be like 36 questions more, but basically it's one more block of an hour. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of questions in one day. It's definitely a marathon. And I do think that me doing 240 questions very regularly throughout my study period helped me maintain that stamina. Obviously, you're going to be very tired after you've sat there for 8 hours, but at least towards the beginning, getting through the first 280 questions wasn't that much more than I had been used to. The other thing on test day is you're going to have ups and downs. For me, my first 3 blocks felt pretty good, and then once I got back from my first break, like my next 2 or 3 sections were brutal, and I felt pretty discouraged, and then towards the end it kind of picked back up. So definitely don't get discouraged or freaked out if you have a tough block. It's going to happen to everyone. You have to keep in mind that there's a lot of experimental questions on this exam that don't count, and then also everything is sort of like curved and scored against everyone. So if 5% of people are getting a certain question right, they're going to factor that in because it's a standardized exam. So the next thing that I wanted to cover before I go into how I was actually scoring on our practice exams was my shelf scores. Another thing that I had seen throughout just a lot of YouTube videos and Reddit surfing was people say that your percentiles that you were getting on your shelf exams throughout your clerkship year are pretty close to the percentile that you're going to score on step 2. So I just wanted to list out my shelf exam scores in sort of the order that I took them. IM was my first rotation, brutal one to start on, I know, just because it's so much content. So I got a 76 on that one, which isn't the best, but it was my first one. It was IM, which is probably the hardest exam. And then as you can see, I just kind of steadily went up throughout the year. Surgery, a little bit better, 80, then FM and neuro were both 82. And then I took a jump up to 89 on both psych and peds, a 90 on OB-GYN, and then a slight step back on EM, which was an 88. EM was a weird clerkship for our school. Not a lot of schools have an EM clerkship and they don't take that exam. We actually had to take our EM shelf, I think 4 days after my OB-GYN one. We also don't really have a dedicated clerkship. It's sort of throughout the whole year. So in all of our other clerkships, we would have 2 EM shifts. So it was kind of hard to study for just because you had to really cram, but I was still happy with that score, and you can really tell that I steadily increased throughout the year, and that's what most people do. I mean, as you've taken these exams and gone through a whole year of clerkships, you have a lot more knowledge and experience to be able to do better on the shelves. But I tried to look up the percentiles for the shelf exams. Sometimes it's hard to find that information, but based on how I did throughout clerkship year, it all kind of averaged out to about the 80th, 81st percentile, which is pretty good. I was very happy with how I at least ended that clerkship year in terms of shelf exams. So now going into how I was doing on my actual step 2 practice exams throughout the whole study process. As I mentioned, my first one was NBME 9, which was 54 days out, and I got a 241. It is pretty interesting, you know, even after doing a whole clerkship year and then doing almost a month of step 1 dedicated study, I took a step back compared to how I was scoring on my step 1 practice things. You know, 241 I was pretty disappointed in, but I was just telling myself, it's your first one, you have 7.5 weeks to study, like you're gonna be okay. So then my next one was one of the UWorld ones, scored a 258, which I was stoked about, 44 days out. Then took another step back with UWorld number 3, and I was like, okay, I have no idea where I'm really scoring now because I keep going up and down. These are pretty far off from each other. And then I was trying to do some research into the UWorld self-assessment number 3 because it's the newest exam. I think it came out maybe like a year ago, and a lot of people tend to drop by like 10 points on that one. So I was like, okay, I'm not gonna freak out yet. I saw a lot of posts of people who took this exam like a few days before their actual step 2, and it's like I dropped 15, 20 points. So I'm just glad that I took it a lot earlier than that. Then I did the second UWorld self-assessment 30 days out and went back up, so I got a 261, so I was very happy with that. And then going back to the NBMEs, 263, 22 days out. Took a slight step back on NBME 11 at a 256, went back up to a 260, then a 270 2 weeks before my exam, so I was very happy with that score. And then as you can see, I kind of went down a little bit at 267 and 266 on the sort of most recent NBMEs. So I mentioned earlier, I sort of peaked a few weeks before my exam and then went back down. It's hard to tell if, you know, I was burnt out or those, you know, NBME 14 and 15 are just a little bit harder. And you know, the interesting thing that I realized talking to my friends throughout this whole process is some exams are just way easier for you than others. I don't know if it was NBME 12 or 13, but you know, I scored pretty well, and then I had friends who were sort of scoring close to where I was, and then they dropped by like 20 points on one of those. So it just kind of depends on your knowledge base and if it lines up to the test that you're taking that day. Then my last 2 assessments were the old and new free 120s, which I took 5 and 3 days before. Old free 120, 87%, which is solid. And then I got a 94 on the new free 120, which I was very happy about. They don't give you a 3-digit score. It's just sort of the raw percentage. I was still happy with both of the scores. So another tool that AMBOSS has that I was using throughout all of this study period is they have a score predictor, where you can enter in all of these practice exams that I just went through, as well as your scores on your shelves. If you can put in like your percentage on UWorld when you did your first pass, and it sort of takes all of that data and predicts your score. It gives you an actual predicted score as well as a range. And so my predicted score was a 268. The range of scores is usually plus or minus 8. So that would range from like a 260 to a 274. After I saw that prediction, I was like, okay, if I'm anywhere in this range, I'm gonna be stoked. I don't really know where they get the plus or minus 8 thing from, but I mean, just looking at my practice exams, I would either go up or down 10 points, even a few days away. So pretty hard to be like extremely consistent on these exams. So that's probably why they have such a broad range in their prediction. But yeah, again, I saw that and I was like, as long as I'm anywhere in this ballpark of this range, I will be happy. So then 2 weeks after I took my exam, I got my score, and my real score was a 264. Right in that range. It was only 4 points below what my predicted score was. Part of me was a little bit disappointed just because it was below that predicted score, and I had seen a lot of people go up based on their AMBOSS predicted score. I cannot be upset at all at that score. As I said, if I was anywhere in that range of AMBOSS prediction, I was going to be happy. And sort of the last thing, it is interesting to look at the percentile that I got on step 2 compared to that sort of average percentile throughout all of clerkship year on my shelf exams. It's pretty close. I mean, it was like an 81st percentile for all my shelf exams, and I was 85th percentile for step 2. I do think that using your shelf exam percentiles as well as, you know, using this AMBOSS predicted score is going to get you pretty close to what you're going to score on test day. And that's pretty much it. I'm so excited to be done with both of those exams. I mean, I still have to take step 3, but that will be in residency, and it is scored. It's not a pass-fail exam, but doesn't really count towards anything in terms of residency or fellowship. So got one more standardized test, and that's pretty much it. But I'm very glad to have that behind me. It was a very stressful time. All right, well, that is gonna do it for today's video. If you have any more questions on how I studied for step 2, want advice, anything like that, feel free to leave your comment or DM me on Instagram. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.